You don't suck at SAT reading. SAT reading sucks. With the December SAT right around the corner, we're predicting several tough nonfiction reading passages. So today, we're going to go through 5 impossible reading questions so you can get a perfect score on the SAT. Getting started with the first question. Saeed Mza Tarabi conducted a study of consumer attitudes towards Jordanian food and beverage companies and found that for consumers who value environmental conservation, their likelihood of purchasing a product decreased when their perception of the product's risk of causing environmental harm increased. Subsequently, other researchers conducted a study of various demographic groups in Australia, investigating participants' intentions to purchase a new television, and found that, on average, middle-aged adults had the lowest perception among all the demographic groups in the study of the environmental risks of the TV. Assuming that the results of Tarabi's study are broadly applicable, this finding suggests that we just read a very thorough paragraph, but this is an incredibly misleading question. 9 times out of 10, when a student sees this on the SAT, they think that in this whole paragraph, there's going to be 3, 4, maybe even 5 different things they need to understand and then apply to the answers. But really, all of this only told us 2 things. So even before we start looking at the answer choices, let's understand what we just learned. First, we need to divide this paragraph into its shifts. We have our first section, which is the study of consumer attitudes towards Jordanian food and beverage companies, the shift, which is seen in subsequently the transition, and then the second study, which is of various demographic groups in Australia, investigating participants' intentions to purchase a new television. From the first section, we only learn one thing, and that's people who value environmental conservation are less likely to purchase a product. In the second shift, we learned that middle-aged adults had the lowest perception among all demographic groups regarding environmental risks. This means middle-aged adults, that demographic, cared the least about environmental conservation relative to other demographics. Now, the question asks if the result of Tarabi's study, which is the first section, effectively saying the more you care about environmental conservation, the less likely you'll buy a product, is broadly applicable. So we can take what we've learned from study 1, apply it to study 2, and maybe that'll get us closer to our answer. Let's get started with A. Middle-aged adults likely prioritize other factors over a product's environmental sustainability when making purchasing decisions. Right off the bat, there's a reason why this is answer choice A. The SAT wants students to read this, assume that it's close enough to a correct answer, press A and move on. But this is wrong. If we look at it objectively speaking, we don't know the priorities and other factors of middle-aged adults. We only know that among other demographic groups, they had relatively the lowest perception. So A is off the table. B. Middle-aged adults might be more likely than participants in the other demographics to purchase the TV. This is correct. We know that middle-aged adults have the lowest perception of environmental risks, meaning they are, if Tarabi's study is broadly applicable, more likely to buy the TV, because it's the inverse relationship where the less you care about environmental conservation, the more likely you're willing to buy a product. We can keep it in the chamber for now, but let's keep looking at the answers. The new TV is less appealing to middle-aged adults than other similar products on the market area. Immediately, no, we're not talking about other similar products, but they did put this in here to trick you because they mentioned food and beverage companies as well as TVs, and even though those are distinct products, they think that some students will just skim over it, see different types of products, and select C. C is off the table. D. There is not a meaningful difference in the average likelihood of purchasing environmentally friendly products among the demographic groups included in the study. Again, totally off topic. This isn't what we're talking about. The correct answer is B. From November 1980 to February 1981, oil prices rose 45%, creating what economists term an oil shock. Although oil shocks have occurred multiple times since 1945, a broadly applicable description of how oil shocks affect economies at the national level has proved elusive. A problem typically attributed to the fact that oil shocks' effects are substantially conditioned on country-specific characteristics, oil import-export ratios most importantly. Recently, however, Go et al. Showed that economists' estimates of national economies' responsiveness to oil shocks are highly heterogeneous, even within a given country and time frame, ranging by more than a factor of 5 in the case of the United States during a recent oil shock, for instance, suggesting that X. This is another case where we have a huge chunk of text, but we don't actually learn that much. In the last question, we learned 2 things. In this, we only learned 1. Let's start off by dividing this paragraph up into its 2 sections. Our first section here tells us that this is a very ambiguous field of economics. Quote unquote, a broadly applicable description of how oil shocks affect economies at the national level has proved elusive. So we don't have this universal term for how oil shocks can affect economies for a country. It is ambiguous. It is different every single time. In the second section, which is divided by the transition recently, however, we learn that estimates of national economies' responsiveness to oil shocks are highly heterogeneous. Again, this is reinforcing that idea that this is a sect of economics that isn't always the same or isn't really easy to understand with one singular framework. Our answer choice needs to reflect that because the question is asking what all of this suggests. Starting off with A, controlling for variations in countries' oil import-export ratios may have obscured inconsistencies in economists' findings about the effects of oil shocks at national levels. This is a mouthful of an answer, but there's only 2 words that really matter. Obscured inconsistencies. If we obscured inconsistencies, that means we would get something that looks right or looks correct. In this case, we're not really talking about if something is right or not, but rather how something is being done and how it's ambiguous in nature. A is not correct. B, economists' conventional measures of national economic activity may be insufficiently sensitive to the effects of oil shocks. In this case, we're not criticizing the methods that economists are using to measure and describe oil shocks, so B is wrong. It's off topic. C, methodological discrepancies in studies of oil shocks may have contributed to economists' inability to provide a generalized model of oil shocks' effect on national economies. This is correct only because it mentions the inability to provide a generalized model of oil shocks' effect on national economies. We don't know for sure about methodological discrepancies. We do know that everyone is doing things a bit differently, but we know for sure that they mention something we know to be true, that there is no standard or generalized model of oil shocks. We're going to keep C in the chamber and move on to D to see if that's correct. Differences in oil import-export ratios from one country to another may account for more of the differences in the effects of oil shocks on those countries' economies than economists previously believed. Again, really off topic. There's nothing in this that very clearly suggests what D is saying, so that means our correct answer is going to be C. Moving on to question 3. Callie W. Babbitt, Hema Madaka, and colleagues assembled a database of materials used in consumer electronics by studying products in the lab and by gathering data from similar product studies. The team gave each of these studies a rating level for level of detail, with a higher rating for reported data with more detail, and for level of traceability, with a higher rating for clear descriptions of procedures. Based on these ratings, a second research team concluded that a study by Paki P. Hikwana provided more specificity in its data than a study by Timothy G. Townsend and colleagues did. Which finding, if true, would most directly challenge the second research team's conclusion? Let's quickly look back and figure out what we just learned by this really complicated reading question. The first thing we learned is that research is going to have one of 2 ratings. The first is a rating for level of detail, and the second is a rating for level of traceability. And for both of these, the higher the rating, the more it is of this attribute, so more detailed or more traceable. Now, the second thing we learned is that a study by Hikwana was claimed to have more specificity in its data than a study by Townsend. Off the bat, what is specificity? This is actually testing our vocab because they didn't use traceability or detail, but they are alluding to the rating scale. Specificity is much more closer in meaning to the word detail, so we're going to assume that more specificity means a higher rating for detail. Now let's answer the question. Which finding, if true, would most directly challenge the second research team's conclusion? Remember, the second research team says Hikwana provided more specificity than Townsend. In other words, Hikwana had a higher detail rating than Townsend. So we need to find something that will directly challenge this, so the opposite. Let's get started with the answer choices. The study by Hikwana had a lower traceability rating than the study by Townsend and colleagues did. Immediately, we're talking about traceability rating in this, so I know this is wrong because I'm looking for a detail rating. B, the study by Hikwana had a lower detail rating than the study by Townsend and colleagues did. This makes sense, and this does directly challenge the second research team's conclusion, but we're going to look through the other answer choices just to make sure. The study by Hikwana had a high detail rating and a high traceability rating. Immediately, no, we're looking for a comparison, not just characteristics about one of the studies. D, the study by Townsend and colleagues had a low detail rating and a low traceability rating. Just like C, same reason, we're looking for a comparison, not a single one. The answer is B. Moving on to question 4. Based on findings from fossil sites, paleobotanists had developed the so-called partition hypothesis, which holds that there were two distinctly different kinds of biomes during the Devonian period, circa 360 to 420 million years ago. One was a tropical deltaic forest biome, home to plants such as the fern-like Eospermatopterus, and the other was an arid floodplain forest biome, home to plants such as the conifer-like Archaeopteris. Recently, however, evolutionary ecologist Kudadad examined the remnants of a Devonian forest in what is now Cairo, New York, and concluded that evidence from the Cairo site is inconsistent with the partition hypothesis. Which finding about the Cairo site, if true, would most directly support Kudadad's conclusion? The first thing we learned is that there is an initial theory called the partition hypothesis, which means effectively that there were two different biomes. There's biome A with a tropical deltaic forest biome and home to plants, the fern-like EO, so I'm just going to call it EO for short. And then there was biome B, which was an arid flood plain and was home to the conifer-like Archaeopteris. So we need to find a claim from one of these answer choices that would support his conclusion that this separated AB biome hypothesis is wrong, because again, he concluded that evidence from the Cairo site is inconsistent with the partition hypothesis. Let's start looking at the answer choices. Although the site appears to have been a tropical deltaic forest during the Devonian period, fossil evidence suggests that EO was present at the time. So this actually tells us absolutely nothing. It does not go against the partition hypothesis. It tells us that it only supports the current theory that in a tropical deltaic forest, you're going to have the EO. So A is wrong. B, the site appears to have been a tropical deltaic forest early in the Devonian period, but transitioned into an arid floodplain forest after the end of the Devonian period. Very off topic. We're not talking about transitioning. We're not talking about any time periods. We're mainly just talking about what is the biome and what sort of beings live there. C, the site appears to have been an arid floodplain forest during the Devonian period and contains fossil evidence of contemporaneous EO and Archaea. So far, this is the best answer because we locate one biome, which is biome B, the arid floodplain forest, but we talk about two different organisms, the Eospermatopterus and the Archaeopteris, which would go against the partition hypothesis and support Kudadad's claim. Let's quickly check D. Fossil evidence from the site suggests that several forest plant species other than Eo and Archaeopteris lived there during the Devonian period. Again, very off task, just like B. We're not talking about other species, we're only talking about these two and these two biomes. So that is why C is our correct answer. Moving on to our fifth and final question. Carolina chickadees are cavity nesting birds that initiate nest building at the same time of year as golden paper wasps, a species that also nests in enclosed spaces. Researchers observed that both species will settle in nesting boxes, but birds and wasps are not often observed co-occupying boxes, leading to the hypothesis that the two species compete for nesting sites. To test this hypothesis, the researchers installed nesting boxes throughout a nature preserve in the US state of North Carolina, manipulated some of the boxes to exclude birds, and then monitored the boxes for 2 years. Not only was the hypothesis validated, there's also a clear indication of competitive advantage for birds. Which finding from the study, if true, would most directly support the text's characterization of the study's results? This passage tells us that chickadees and golden paper wasps both use nesting boxes. They rarely co-occupy them, and that researchers have a validated hypothesis that birds have a clear advantage. So they tested this by creating manipulated boxes that exclude birds to show this competitive advantage. The correct answer for this needs to 1. Show evidence of competition between the two species, and 2. Show evidence that when wasps and birds are competing, birds usually win. Let's take a look at the answer choices. Choice A talks about even though overall usage of the nesting boxes by wasps and birds was high throughout the study, 24% of the manipulated boxes remained vacant each spring, while less than 4% of the unmanipulated nesting boxes remained vacant. Again, a huge mouthful of an answer, but if we break this down, we know that choice A talks about vacancy rates in manipulated versus unmanipulated boxes, which doesn't tell us who is outcompeting whom, so it doesn't directly show either competition or a bird advantage. So A is off the table. Moving on to choice B. Nest initiation by either birds or wasps, but not both, was observed in more than 90% of the unmanipulated boxes, but nest initiation by wasps was observed in less than 50% of the manipulated boxes. This is one of those answers that is going to try and throw you off. B shows that usually only one species starts a nest in a box, which does hint at competition, and this is why they want you to pick B. But then it focuses on how wasps often initiate nesting in manipulated boxes, and it never shows birds having the upper hand. Remember, if a wasp wants a manipulated box, that's safe for the wasp because manipulated boxes are bird excluded. So B is off the table. Moving on to C. Wasps initiated nesting in manipulated boxes much more often than in unmanipulated boxes, and 80% of initial co-occupations of unmanipulated boxes resulted in abandonment by wasps but not by birds. The first sentence here validates our claim, and this is why C is correct. It does both things we need. First, it talks about wasps starting nest more often in bird excluded or manipulated boxes. It shows that they're going to use these boxes when birds aren't around, which alludes to competition. Also, it shows that in co-occupied unmanipulated boxes, wasps will abandon the nest 80% of the time while birds won't, which shows that birds have a clear competitive advantage. Before we click C, let's quickly move on to D to see if that's correct. Although only 15 instances of co-occupation of unmanipulated boxes by wasps and birds were observed over the course of the study, in a majority of those instances, wasps were already occupying the boxes when birds initiated nesting in them. D only tells us that when co-occupation happens, wasps are there first. That only talks about the timing of these beings and not the competitive advantage of them. So the correct answer is C.